And today our concept is the science behind synchronicity. Probably, not probably, certainly, in the 7,500-year recorded history of humankind, the single most important thing which is unraveling for the human species. And this thing which is unraveling, it's more powerful, it's more meaningful, and philosophically more uplifting than anything that has happened, except perhaps the basic, experiential happenings centered around some of the prophets and what we would call holy men. So whether Zarathustra or Buddha or Mahavir or Jesus, Muhammad, Guru Nanak, Ramakrishna Paramahansadev, any one of these people, and many more around the world, what they have gone through in an experiential state, what is happening now is the science is saying, or part of the science at least is saying, that you can have this experience. Everybody can have it. All of us. But there are certain conditionalities if we want to reach that stage. But it can be reached. And it's not, miraculous. It's an everyday occurrence. And how does this happen? I mean, how can a person become a Nanak or a Jesus or a Muhammad or a Ramakrishna or a Mahavir or a Buddha or a Zarathustra? How? So we are going to look into that story. And it is the single most important happening for humankind. But we are storytellers. We are not creating the story. The story is already there in the public domain. I'm just bringing it to you. And I'm going to suggest a couple of things for you to read and watch, which are mind-blowing. So we begin basically with this. What is synchronicity? Synchronicity is a causal coincidence. A causal coincidence is not a coincidence. A causal happening is when I decide to visit, say, Maya and Zach in Canada. I buy a ticket. The day of the journey arrives. I take a transport which I've ordered. I go to the airport, check in. All those processes are causal. I'm creating an action which is having a causal reaction from the environment. And I board the flight. I go there, and they're waiting at the airport, and they pick me up, and I go to their home. These are all causal. But suppose I'm thinking and I'm listening to a favorite classical musical piece of mine, and I watch the performance in Salzburg, and I'm saying, wow, let me see which year. Oh, this is 5 years ago, the Salzburg Summer Festival of Music. And I said, my God, I just wish I could be there. And about 3 days later, Zach and Maya call me and say, hey, Gautam, will you and Shushata be interested in going to the Salzburg Music Festival? Because we've got 2 tickets and there is just no way we can make it. And there are 2 free air tickets. We can send it to you. I know you guys will love it. That's synchronous. One day maybe it'll happen. Who knows? But it's, it's causal. I didn't wish it. I didn't contact them, but it just sort of fell from the sky. And these situations happen many times. How do they happen? Why do they happen? And when do they happen? That's what our story today is about, okay? So we begin with a guy called Arthur Koestler, a favorite author of mine, long time back in the 70s, 80s. He was a great thinker who became a communist, who opted out of communism, participated in a book called The God That Failed. But most importantly, he wrote one of the books which is considered one of the best 100 books of the 20th century, The Darkness at Noon. It's one of my 5 favorite books of all time. But this Darkness at Noon inspired George Orwell's 1984 and George Orwell's Animal Farm, because George Orwell was going nowhere with his non-fiction. And he was really mad about what was happening in communism and the stifling of the human spirit. And he wanted to write, but he realized his reach was too limited with non-fiction. So he took a page out of Kessler's book with Darkness and Noon. Darkness and Noon was really, really, it knocked communism really badly, and wrote 1984 and Animal Farm. But that's not what we are on about today. The book about that we are concerned of for Kessler is a book which he wrote Roots of Coincidence. The Roots of Coincidence, where he put out everything that I have been discussing. And this was in the 70s and 80s, where every scientific activity was ruled by the scientific Taliban. You could say like Orthodox Brahmanism, or the jihadist, or the Southern Baptist, call them whatever you will, but the science group had the same kind of thinking. We'll come to why. Now, in that book, he starts off with a very interesting example. And I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to read a couple of things with you, what happened. Professor Gilbert Murray. Gilbert Murray was one of the greatest thinkers of the world at that time. He drafted the covenant for the League of Nations. So imagine a guy who the whole world has gone to for drafting the covenant for the League of Nations. So he's not an average Joe. And Gilbert Murray shares this experience. It's an experiment which he conducted in 1952 in England. What he did was about 505 times he conducted this experiment, where in a country house, a very large country house in England, he was with friends and relatives, and he was sent out, and the door was closed, and he was sent way out. And then in his absence, the people there, one person volunteered and gave a statement, one statement, which was noted down, right? Now, Murray was called back. And Professor Murray then was asked, what was that statement that we said and noted down in your absence? And he gave a reply. And guess what? 60% of the responses were what they said. 40% deviations, but they were not bad deviations, they were pretty close. And I'm going to read just 3 to make you understand the kind of statements which he was challenged by. So the first statement, Countess of Carlisle. The statement is, quote, the Crimean soldiers after their return, receiving their medals from Queen Victoria at the Horse Guards. Okay? The Crimean soldiers after their return, receiving their medals from Queen Victoria at the Horse Guards, unquote. Professor Murray's version, is it the king giving VCs and things to people? Yes, I think it's an investiture of some kind. Okay. Second, Countess of Carlisle again. Thinking of the Lusitania, unquote. Thinking of the Lusitania. Professor Murray, I've got this violently. I've got an awful impression of naval disaster. I should think it was the torpedoing of the Lusitania. Third, Murray's daughter, Rosalind. I think of dancing with the head of the Dutch Foreign Office at a cafe, Chanton at The Hague. Professor Murray, a faint impression of your journey abroad. I should say something official, some sort of official soiree or dancing or something. Feel as if it was in Holland. Now, these are where he got it. Where he didn't get it, and an example of that, and you'll understand how close he was. Margaret Davis says, quote, Medici Chapel and tombs, sudden chill, absolute stillness, marble figures who seem to have been there all night. Okay? Medici Chapel and tombs, sudden chill, absolute stillness, marble figures who seem to have been there all night. Professor Murray, I wonder if this is right. I've got a feeling of a scene in my Nephrecrypta, where the man goes in passage after passage to an inner chamber where Nephrecrypta is lying dead, with the shadows of his wife and child sitting beside him. But I think it's Indian. So this is what was considered as he didn't get it. But what's happening here? Here is a man who's physically outside the room. The group decides on a statement in his absence, and he comes back and recites it. So what we are seeing is a passage of the transmission of thought. So thought is moving. But how can thought move from one physical body to another without, an approximate distance which makes it possible? And here there are two doors which were closed. Against this, Kessler then takes the reader for a weird ride. And bear with me, I'm going to take you on that ride for a purpose. So Paul Dirac from Cambridge in 1931 put out a quantum physics theory. A theory which said that space is not empty. Space is filled with negative mass. They're negative neutrons. It's difficult to understand what is negative mass. So it's explainable like this. If you push negative mass, it comes back at you. If you blow, it, is sucked into your lungs. That's negative mass. And he said, in this ocean and bottomless sea of negative mass, once in a while, a cosmic ray will break through and hit one negative electron, which jumps up and becomes a positive electron with a flash. But when it jumps up, it leaves behind a hole in that ocean. Now that hole is negative, but it is in negativity. So negative and negative, it becomes a positive electron. It becomes what he calls an anti-electron. Now this anti-electron doesn't survive for long because a normal electron is attracted to the hole, falls in, and they annihilate each other in a flash of cosmic rays. This was too crazy to even conceptualize. And if you're not being able to understand it, don't blame yourself, because Neils Bohr, who was perhaps the greatest quantum physicist of all time, couldn't figure it out. And he wrote a spoof about it and published it. And the spoof was called How to Capture an Elephant. And what was the spoof? Spoof was, suppose a hunter, Arun Kiri, is going to capture an elephant. So Arun goes to Africa, goes to the favorite watering hole of the elephant, and puts up a signboard with Paul Dirac's theory on it. Now the elephant comes to the watering hole, its favorite watering hole, and the elephant, being the wisest of the mammals, stops and starts reading. And he reads Dirac's theory. And he's so stunned that he's immovable, he can't move. At that time, the hunter, Arun Kiri, jumps out, puts a rope around the elephant's leg, and takes it away to Copenhagen Zoo. That was Niels Bohr's spoof. But guess what happened? 1932, Carl Anderson in Caltech proved it without having read Dirac's paper. And in 1933, Dirac got the Nobel Prize for his theory. Now, where is Kessler going with all this? Where he's going is he's trying to tell you that all of us, we have preconceived notions of what we know. And to step outside that, very, very difficult. If a guy like Niels Bohr couldn't do it, the guy who is considered the god of quantum physics, Robert Oppenheimer was considered Jesus, and OP was Jesus, and Niels Bohr was considered God of quantum physics. He couldn't figure it out. So you can imagine how difficult it is for an average Joe, an average scientist, average man of science, forget the layperson, to even conceptualize some of these things. So what's his point? He goes one step further, and he says, when Johann Kepler, the guy who made the laws of planetary motions, said the tides on Earth are the result of pull from the moon, Galileo laughed and called it occult fantasy. He wrote a thing called occult fantasy. He said it can't happen. But it took Newton and his gravitational laws to prove that Kepler was right. The tides are because of our distance with the moon. But Kessler's saying that, listen, some of these things are really, really mind-blowing. And to understand them, you have to step out of your known world. It's not easy. And it really, really takes a real hard swipe at the scientific community. And he says the scientific community, he's frustrated, angry, disappointed that they've let humanity down because they've become what, somebody like Max Weber would call a bureaucrat. You become a bureaucrat in science. This is the law, and without this, you cannot work. But after this, Kessler introduces Pauli and Jung's synchronicity in his book. And he introduces it beautifully. And he says, when an acausal happening, like we said about that Salzburg music thing and Maya and Zach sending me the tickets for the festival as well as the plane tickets, that acausal thing, when it happens, without the, without the causal dealing, without the causal thing bringing it in, that's when synchronicity happens. But you cannot summon it. You cannot will it to happen. You cannot willfully connect. Then how does it happen? So Pauli wrote this thesis, and he expected Carl Jung, who was, dabbling with the collective unconscious, which he was very, very wary of presenting to the world. Very wary. That he thought that the two of them would be able to make a team. Surprisingly, it was Pauli who stuck his neck out, his scientific neck out for the chopping block. His wife was so scared, she wanted to burn the manuscript after his death, thinking that his scientific reputation will be ruined. But Carl Jung, tiptoed around it. Didn't have the courage that Pauli had. But he suggested it. It came out. He wrote a lot about synchronicity, but Jung, as people who read Jung, was a very difficult person to read. And he went around in circles, but nothing really that concrete. But they put the item on the table, right? It's there on the table. And Kessler, by the way, when he died, he left £1 million, which is a lot of money in the 80s, a lot of money, for a university to use it for research on the paranormal. And guess what? He lived in England, so he offered it to a British university. Oxford refused. Cambridge refused. King's College refused. University College London refused. And the only ones who reluctantly took it were Edinburgh University. And Edinburgh reluctantly took it and began that department. But that's Kessler's legacy. We moved from the early days to an absolute recent. Pauli had a point on this, so I'm going to cover this a bit right now, is Deepak Chopra's book, Synchro Destiny, where he collates a lot of scientific happenings and presents it. And it's a recent book about 10 years ago. I think it's around 2007 or 2010, where he gives, I'll give you 3 examples from his lab situations. He mentions Cleve Baxter. Cleve Baxter is mentioned by a lot of people today. Cleve Baxter is dealing with things in the lab to measure this kind of happening, what Gilbert Murray underwent. One example which Baxter puts down is a sperm donor. When the sperm donor has come, given a sperm which is in a test tube, and he's moved 40 feet away to another room. And there he puts a bursts an amyl nitrate tablet, a popper, and he gets a high. And he gets it's a real high. But when he gets a high, the sperms which are in that test tube 40 feet away also go high. They sort of party. They are in absolute intensing, and these are all connected to EEG kind of instrumentation systems with electrodes and graphs and machines. They just go bonkers. Second one, Baxter is taking oral. He's sort of trying to get white cells. So he takes his oral spit and he centrifuges it to get white cells. And while his centrifugal machine is working on it, he decides to cut his hand to see if there's any reaction. And he's gone to look for a lancet to slice a little bit of the top and make a little wound. And he's looking for a sterilized lancet. Now, when he's gone to get the lancet, just with the thought, his cells have gone crazy. The EEG machine has gone crazy. He hasn't done it yet, but the very thought of doing it has created in the test tube of the centrifuged white cells craziness. They are really intense. The third one is the funniest. Baxter's lab assistant was told, now he was looking at oral leukocytes, and he was working on that, and he was told that, there is a interesting article, an interview with a scientist in the Playboy magazine, which is there in the room next door. Just have a look. So the assistant goes to look at that Playboy, and that Playboy, which incidentally I had for a long time, has a center spread of Bo Derek in her splendor. And 8 pages of Bo Derek in her splendor. Those photographs I remember beautiful. And this lab assistant is looking at those Bo Derek pictures. Now those leukocytes have gone crazy. So when he comes back and he sees this, then he closes the magazine. They relax. And when he opens the magazine and looks at Bo Derek again, they go crazy. How is this happening? Now, all this is ignored by the scientific community. Okay. A couple of other things which Deepak Chopra puts up. Deepak Chopra also talks about Rupert Sheldrake. And he discusses Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake was a NASA scientist, came back to England, and he talked about morphic fields which govern us. Morphic fields, he says, like birds, when they're flying together, or migrating birds who come and land 4,000 miles away at the exact same spot every year, or dolphins who move from ocean to ocean to hit a place where there's, fish which are multiplying exactly at the right time, or dogs which know when the master is returning home. A friend told us a story about 8 years ago when we were discussing synchronicity. He was in Bombay and he was going back to Bangalore. And instead of going back on the Saturday morning, he went back on Friday morning. His work got done. And he said he was going to surprise his wife because originally they had a concert ticket for Friday, and he said they couldn't make it because he was going to be stuck in Bombay. But because he got off a day earlier, he was going to surprise his wife. Sorry, he was coming back on Thursday evening. So when he landed up on Thursday evening, as a surprise, he found that his wife had cooked and laid out 2 places for dinner. So he said, how did you know? I didn't call you. So the wife smiled and pointed to the dog. The dog's name was Funky. So he said, Funky knew. She said, how? He said, Funky was waiting near the door, and you only wait near the door when you're coming home. So Funky knew that he had changed his program and he was taking the flight home from Bombay to Bangalore on Thursday evening. And she said, I knew you were coming and you were going to surprise me. So I cooked for 2. Now, this is Rupert Sheldrake's presenting it and saying there are millions of such happenings. But science refuses to consider them. Why? Why did science refuse to consider them? Because of what I mentioned in my last talk, Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions, where he says that we live in paradigms. And the paradigm is so strong, it's held together by school textbooks. college textbooks, professors, teachers, funding for research, presentations, government interaction, corporate funding, corporate interaction. That to break out of that and go into Siberia, very difficult, because then you're cut off and you have to face, ignominy from your colleagues and peers who look down on you, sarcasm, you're banished, you're pariah, you're untouchable, no funding, your career's finished. These are all risks no professional wants to take. And in terms of the layperson, you are conditioned by everything that's being put out. So Kuhn said, if you remember, I'm just recapping, three things, three anomaly responses. When anomalies come up, there are three responses. First, ignore. Couldn't be happening. Something must be happening. Clive Baxter must be doing something fishy to tamper with the evidence, or it's his imagination. Forget it. Gilbert Murray, maybe somebody had whispered it to him when he was outside. Maybe there's a listening device connected to that room. Just ignore it. Ignore. Second, make small changes to accommodate the anomaly. But if these can't be done and the anomaly builds up, as it has happened today for synchronicity, then a new paradigm has to come into place. And those who are the rebels are brought in. But they pay an awful price, really an awful price. So against this Kuhn's thing, and Kuhn, remember, his subject was the philosophy of science. The philosophy of science. That's what his departmental subject was. He was in Berkeley, he was in Princeton, he was in Harvard. Now, there's another guy who I'm going to share with you, who bridges this gap. He's also philosophy of science. His name is Nicholas Maxwell. So Nicholas Maxwell, born 1917, still going strong. Nicholas Maxwell talks about the difference between the philosophy of knowledge versus the philosophy of wisdom. Knowledge pursuit versus pursuit of wisdom. But before that, he breaks down philosophy. And he says, excuse me, earlier, science was a part of philosophy. Very much so. It was called natural philosophy, how nature functions and operates. Science has been usurped by man as saying, this is man's arena. It's rubbish. It is nature, how nature functions. And till Galileo and Kepler, they both respected this, that philosophy and science are an integral body which cannot be separated. Separation was done by Isaac Newton with good intentions, but it was done by him. Newton said science cannot be hypotheses alone, they have to be experimental, evidence-based. All science has to be evidence-based and derived out of evidence and induction from evidence. Now this was picked up by the French Enlightenment, spread all over the world, that science is evidence-based. The good was that a lot of superstitious nonsense ultimately got wiped out with this kind of a attitude. That if you can't prove it, it's actually BS. So a lot of the old superstition in society, in all societies, got challenged by this, and when they couldn't themselves, they got wiped out. Okay. But the bad thing is it separated science and took it out of the house of philosophy and made it a standalone and gave it enormous amount of arrogance and pride to say that we know. And if you can't have evidence, you don't know. And what you say is not relevant or not true. But what happens to this vast area outside this little tiny arena that science knows. What happens to that? Which requires human imagination, which requires a leap of faith sometimes, which requires maybe that connection with the non-local intelligence, which we are coming to. What happens to that? No go. The brain is the desktop computer, the heart is your building water pump, it's pumping water, period. A very, very simplistic approach. And within that, there were some anomalies which they started making some changes, and the Taliban, led by people like Richard Dawkins, just sort of went hammer and tongs at anybody who'd step out of line. Anybody stepping out of line, mystical, religious, absolutely gone, killed. Now, what is...
Can I ask a quick question here, Gautam?
Yeah.
So this, you started with Pauli, that was 1930s or so, right?
Yeah.
And so it's now 90 years, 70, 80, 90 years. So even today, even though there has been a more and more evidence, especially with this whole energy healing and energy component coming into the forefront, so how is that affecting the real science, the protected science, so to speak?
Correct. So I'll answer that with Maxwell's philosophy and basically the guy who bridged the gap. And I'll tell you who obstructed it, who stopped it, before I answer your question, because that's what you are asking. That why didn't it happen? I mean, with all this evidence lying around, why did people refuse to even look at it? So, and I'll tell you, the kind of Maharathis, the kind of really big thinkers who fell into that Kuhn trap of the paradigm. But this Nicholas Maxwell says that philosophy and science have to integrate again. Number one. Number two, science cannot be a standalone action. It has to be as a part of philosophy and for serving the common good of humankind. And you have to understand what is the common good of humankind. He said science has gone, we are putting men on the moon, we are sending vehicles to Mars, but why can't we look at the climate crisis or the environmental problem or the extinction of the species or global poverty? Why can't we address or violence in inner cities and violence in societies? Why can't we use science to address these issues and solve them? But science is not doing that. Science is pursuing a path which is very narrow and some people are saying very selfish and very inward looking. And what Maxwell is saying is this is not on. You can't do this. You have to, science must make itself a part of the world of philosophy. Okay. So coming to Malavika's thing. What Nicholas Maxwell was looking for was scientists who would step out and become philosophers. And using their philosophical thought process, take science out of this cloistered, suffocating, small little room which it was locked up in, and open it up to the possibilities, what Malavika is suggesting. And that's the guy I'm going to really focus on. And that's our hero for today. He's the hero for the world, for quantum physics. He's the rock star of quantum physics today, but he's had a very tough life because he defied the establishment. This guy is David Bohm. And you must read David Pete's biography of David Bohm called Infinite Potential. And Paul Howard has made this film called Infinite Potential. I suggest don't pay $6 and just see it. Download it for $11.99 because you're going to see it many times. And it's a beautiful film. And thinkers and physicists all around the world have said it's a fantastic film. The name of the film is, and it's about an hour. So it puts the whole Bohm thought process in perspective. And whatever I'm telling you, you will find it in greater detail and expanded with a lot of physicists coming and speaking. And this bridge between science and philosophy is happening, but not in Bohm's lifetime, tragically, not in Bohm's lifetime. So who was this guy? And what did he say? And what did he do? And why is he relevant for our storytelling session today? And why is he so relevant to all of humankind tomorrow? So David Bohm, born in a coal town in Pennsylvania, and so Chow probably lived very close to where you lived. And he went to college in Penn State. His father was very, very unhappy with his pursuit of science. And he used to read science fiction and he used to write science papers. And he was brilliant in maths and physics, two subjects which he always taught. His father wanted him to be, growing up, to be a furniture and electronic goods salesman to help him with his business, which was a small, tiny little shop. But he said, my son is going to help me with this. So why is he wasting his time with science? He should focus on how to sell, tables and chairs, and then later on electronics or radios. But Bohm went to what is now, it was college, but it's State University, and he did very well. And because of his academic results, he got a scholarship in Caltech. So he goes off to Caltech, where he was very unhappy, very unhappy. And he was unhappy because they were, again, putting little labels and saying, this is your area, don't go out of this. This is what you should read, don't read that. So this don't and do and don't and do. He was getting fed up. And his mind wanted to get the freedom to fly. But he was not being allowed to do that. And he performing very badly. He was performing really badly. But he had written a couple of brilliant papers until he met Robert Oppenheimer. And Oppenheimer, as you know, was called the Jesus of quantum physics with Niels Bohr as God. And Oppenheimer had gone to Europe and he had done his PhD under Max Born in Göttingen, which I had mentioned last time about Pauli's that Göttingen experience. And James Franck, who was the director of the lab which had that machine breakdown for Pauli, James Franck did the Viva for Oppenheimer. And when it finished, he goes and tells Bond, thank God that's over. It had reached a stage when he was going to question me, because Oppenheimer was way, way ahead of everybody. But Oppenheimer was a polymath. He looked at everything. And I'm telling you a little bit about Oppenheimer because to give you an idea of what shaped Bohm, his initial ideas. Remember, he's a very young man, very vulnerable. And Oppenheimer was dining. He started the quantum physics department in Berkeley, probably the first in the USA. And he was having lunch in the faculty dining room. And a person sharing the table with him was J. Arthur Ryder, the head of the Sanskrit department of Berkeley. And they talk. And Oppenheimer signs up to be a Sanskrit student in the Sanskrit department. And he does the full program, no shortcuts. And his two favorite books were the Gita and Meghdootam by Kalidas. And Oppenheimer later on, becomes a head of and he had a lot of communist friends. His circle was filled with communist and communist sympathizers because they wanted to do good for humanity. They wanted to bring down the inequality of income between the high and the low. They wanted to spread wealth. And from that perspective, he was interested in art, literature, everything, global literature. But he was made the head of the Manhattan Project, the first atom bomb of the world. And it was desperately needed to stop the war. And Oppenheimer, at the time of the explosion, you might remember, I mentioned it last time, recited in Sanskrit, not in English, Krishna's words. That where Krishna's real Vishnu is being described, that light of 1,000 suns. And later on, in an interview, he says, I am death. And he says that also in Sanskrit. But Oppenheimer really took to Bohm. And Bohm, of course, met him, became close, and then shifted from Caltech to Berkeley for his PhD. And they became very close, as were several PhD students with Oppenheimer. They sort of revered him. But unfortunately, Bohm became a Communist Party member for about 9 months, and then he, resigned. But he had a lot of communist friends. For the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer wanted Bohm. But because of his communist background, for the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer himself had enormous amount of problem, but the American army realized and the military realized that without Oppenheimer, the bomb was not going to happen. So they had to make him the head of the project. But Bohm, no way. Not only that, the xenophobia went so far that they said Bohm's PhD thesis was going to be used in the bomb making process. His PhD thesis was going to be used in the bomb making process in Manhattan Project, but he was denied security clearance. So he couldn't visit his PhD thesis papers. He couldn't look into the PhD thesis. He couldn't write it. He couldn't complete it. His own paper, his own thought, his own thing which he had put across, they were going to use it, but he says, you can't use it. So it's absolutely nuts. You could have just redone it. But he got his PhD by Oppenheimer because of the power Oppenheimer had in Berkeley, saying that, yes, he's completed his PhD and I have taken the Viva. And that was all. And it was done. So he got his PhD. But there were germs of a major problem all his life, good and bad. So he goes and becomes an assistant professor of physics in Princeton. And right next door in Princeton, within Princeton, in the Institution of Advanced Studies, is Albert Einstein. And they become very close, very, very close. But it's the McCarthy era, early 50s. And Bohm, because of his earlier communist connections, is called up before the Senate committee and asked to testify as to who were the communists. And he refuses. So he's going to be jailed. And then, is he a communist? He takes the Fifth Amendment. And then a law is passed that those who are taking the Fifth Amendment can be jailed. And he's arrested. And of course, he gets off about a year later and he gets bail immediately. He's taken from Princeton to Washington, D.C. and put under arrest, but he gets bail and he's released. And eventually, but in the process, his services are terminated by the Princeton management. Albert Einstein is pleading that I need him. And then they say that you transfer him to my institute as my assistant. No. Then Oppenheimer tells him, just leave this country. And makes it possible for him to leave. And he leaves soon after his passport, American citizenship is cancelled. And he goes to Sao Paulo in Brazil. And from Brazil, I'm going to cut this story short because it's not integral to our main story. He goes to Haifa in Israel, where he meets his wife, Sarah, and then he goes to Bristol, and then finally comes and rests at Birkbeck College, University London. It's a small college, which was going to be a stepping stone, but they gave him so much love, affection, freedom to do whatever he wanted, that in spite of the low pay, that became that little nest for the rest of his life. Now, how is he relevant today? In 52, of course, he wrote this Hidden Variables, an article, which shocked the Copenhagen interpretation, shocked Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and they sort of went ballistic. They went bonkers on it. Oppenheimer was asked in class by students, what do you think of Bohm's paper? What is wrong with it? So Oppenheimer says nothing. So, and then he refuses to discuss it. And then he puts out a word to all physicists that since we are not going to be able to answer Bohm, let's ignore him. And Bohm was devastated in Sao Paulo. He expected a tidal wave of criticism, this, that, but there was complete silence, a blanket of silence. Nobody responded. Nobody. Till that paper came up almost 50, 60 years ago and was proven to be correct. But all the big guys, Niels Bohr, Heisenberg, Oppenheimer, all fell to the old paradigm. They did not want, they had become the orthodoxy, Malavika.
I need to ask a question here, Gautam.
Yeah, yeah.
You need to remind me, at least I don't know, what was the thesis that Bohm was putting out that they threw him out for?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the
Crux of the matter.
that's what the thing is. Now Bohm, there are 5 things which he should be remembered today, right now. I mean, there are many things. He wrote Plasma of Metals while he was in doing his PhD. He wrote a lot of things, but let's look at 5 things which has shaken the world, which are today accepted. The first of all, he says the language is wrong. And you'll understand this, Maravika, and all those who do healing. The language is very important. When you correct us and say, I will be prosperous, then you'll continue to travel down that road and never be prosperous. Will is in the future. You have to say, I am prosperous. So the language is very important. And Bohm said, the language is very critical to understanding what we are talking about. And he says that this building blocks of science, all of which we have grown up with. I remember my physics teacher telling me the building blocks of nature is science, biology. This word building blocks, all of us have heard it. Bohm says building blocks is blasphemous. There are no building blocks of nature. And he creates a new language called Rheo node, R-H-E-O node, N-O-D-E. Rheo, from the Greek word, which means to flow. He says it has to flow. And he says we have to change the way we speak, because unless we change the way we speak, we are not going to get there, or we are not going to be there to understand this greatness. That's the first point. The second point is he is really the symbol of Nicholas Maxwell. He says physics has unfortunately come down to, these because of the victim of the language and the thought of our smallness of mind. So the physics is now classroom, formulations, laboratories, but the physics of today is really a prescription to understand the greatest questions which humankind has asked. And this is where he really crucifies himself. He says, who are we? Where have we come from? What is our purpose in life, and where are we going? A physicist asking these questions, the whole Newtonian world which still exists. What is this? You've gone nuts. And then he says that Kessler had put out something which is very interesting, and I'm going to go back to it. And I left it because I want to go back to Kessler again and then link Kessler and Bohm. Kessler puts out a model called the holon, Janus-faced holon. What is a holon? A holon is, it's like, the essence of the hologon is an oxymoron. It says the parts of the holon are independent, autonomous, assertive, but they are also integrated with the whole. They're connected to the whole. They're connected with each other. And why Janus face? Janus was a Roman god, mythological figure, the god of portals, of doorways, of change, of flow, of the two-faced Janus, in and out. So exit, entrance, and this thing of transition. So Kessler put this concept together and said it's a holon. And Bohm says there is an implicate order and there's an explicate order. So the explicate order is what we see, that we are there. And he says physics thought that they were the champions of humankind looking at the universe from an outside, from a stage which they put themselves in. But really, they are an integral part of the universe, and they are inside looking out. And what is this implicate order? He gives a very nice example to a interviewer, a Canadian interviewer, a Japanese guy. And he says that I said, I saw this on BBC science program yesterday, and it really applies. Use it as an analogy, please. It's not a quantum physics experiment. So he said there's a fixed test tube around which there's a larger test tube which revolves outside, which can revolve, and it's filled with glycerine. Okay, so when you revolve the glycerine, because of the fixed test tube inside, which acts as a pivot, the glycerine rotates around that. Now he says, I put a drop of indelible carbon black ink, one drop. What happens? It's a glob. But as I move the glycerine, that drop becomes a thin and thin and thin and thinner stream, till finally it disappears. It's gone. It's no longer there. Where's the drop? Where's the ink? And then I start rotating it in the opposite direction. When I start rotating it in the opposite direction, a thin line appears, becomes thicker till the drop reappears. And he says, you put 3 drops and they behave the same way. He says, all of humankind, the entire universe, the cosmos, we are all part of the whole as well as the individual. The implicate order includes the explicate order. That's the second point. Third point. And the fourth point, he works with Carl Pilbram, who's a neuroscientist from Stanford, and they create the holographic brain. What is the holographic brain? And if you remember, I told you the story of Tansy asking the neurologist last time, think of a favorite image of your mom. And they thought of it and said, where do you park it? Till I asked the question. And Tansy is suggesting that it was parked cloud computing. So Bohm says, the holographic brain, what is a holograph? What is a holograph? As different from a photograph. You cut a photograph, half the image is gone. But you take away a part of the holograph, it still is there. You take a little bit more, it's still there. Maybe a little hazy, but it's still there. It doesn't disappear. So the holograph is how the universe operates. We are part of the whole and we are connected. And there is a non-local connectivity. The connectivity is non-local. And this last part he gets into with a 25-year-old dialogue with Krishnamurti. His wife Saral finds a book where Krishnamurti said, the observer is the observed. And if you remember, I told you about the double slit experiment last time, where when you're looking at it, the particles become waves, but when you try to observe it, they become particles again. So how does the particles or the waves know that they're being observed? Even when you're not in the room and you've got a video machine which is recording, even then they know. So how do they know this? So the observer is the observed. It's a very Upanishadic thought also. And so he immediately starts getting in touch with Krishnamurti and they start talking and they have this dialogue for 25 years. Now, I'm not going to recommend just going into the consciousness or thought dialogues of Krishnamurti and Bohm, because what happens is it's very difficult for a person who's listening in, because these dialogues went for 20 years. So some of them do you think this could oh no, this is this or that? So it's feeling each other out. They're recorded for posterity for their honesty and truthfulness and factualness and you could say evidence. But the meat comes out when you take out the essence. Now this, again, all the people around Bohm were horrified. All the people, his friends, his supporters, they said, my God, you're going to really to the extreme. And you're going to really, you're putting yourself out on a limb. But he did it. And they conceptualized thought. Where does thought come from? And I'm coming back to Deepak Chopra, where Deepak Chopra says that, one cell, like the acorn or like the seed, creates the oak tree. One cell multiplies 50 times and becomes a trillion, 100 trillion cells, 100 trillion cells with 250 categories. That makes us who we are. So that's holy, or that's chow, or that's cash. 250 varieties of 100 trillion cells. But now suppose Cash says, I'm going to wriggle my toes. Okay, he wants to wriggle his toes. So what does he do actually to wriggle his toes? Cash has a thought which goes to the brain and sends an electromagnetic signal to a nerve which emits a chemical which goes and helps wriggle the toe. Where does the thought come from? where's Cash's thought originated from to wriggle his toe? That's what Krishnamurti and Bohm discuss. Where do thoughts come from? Because thoughts also create the Holocaust and the Hitlers of the world, the genocides, the climate change. Thoughts create things which are like the extinction of the species. And this is what Bohm has put on the table. Now, Deepak Chopra sums it up in his book, 4 points. That there has to be intensity for thought to connect. Then there is a connection which happens with the local with the non-local. And because the universe is connected, the particles are all connected. Now, Bohm and everybody has proved that what Einstein said, that light is the fastest thing in the universe, is wrong. It's not 186,000 miles per second. That's passé. Thought is. And thought, because one particle on one side of the universe communicates with another particle, another side of the universe, millions of light years away, instantaneously. How does it happen? So the laws of time, space, everything is gone. And what he did was, he took the laws of Einstein, theory of relativity, with the laws of quantum physics. And relativity was a very big cosmic things, and the laws of quantum physics, very small, the micro. He put the areas where they overlap together. And he said, it's whole. Guys, it's not a separate thing. Don't look at it here and here. This is all committed. So when, my wife, Shushita, or we were a house guest, her Reiki guru, does a scan of somebody, say in Bangalore, sitting in Calcutta, and says, yes, this is the diagnosis. They do the diagnosis here. They don't do it as a fun. They don't do it as a joke. They don't do it to prove anything. But if there's a serious case, they do it. It's always correct. How do they do it? And this is Bohm, and this is Deepak Chopra. And Deepak Chopra's warning is, you can't do it consciously. It is from the subconscious. You can't say, I am going to connect. It doesn't happen. The word, when you say, I am going to connect, you don't connect. And then meditation and mindfulness, what John Kabat-Zinn and what Richard Davidson has done, which I mentioned in my last talk in Wisconsin, Madison, which showed that through thought, we change and have altered states of our brain cells, of our body cells. So you have neuroplasticity and epigenetics, which have come in as new fields of study. So we can change through thought. But where the devil has this thought originated from, and where is it connected to? That, my friends, you got to watch The Infinite Potential. It's a fabulous film. I hope I've given you enough josh to pursue the journey, because it's the single most important journey for all of humankind since, Lucy and Turkana Bay and the Johansons and the Leakeys, when we discovered the fossils in Olduvai Gorge, which we visited 3 million years ago, the Australopithecus afarensis. And from Australopithecus afarensis, when we come today, this is the single most important thing. Follow it.